My director stood up in front of the whole team and said, "I lost us our biggest client." He was wrong, and some part of me spent 3 weeks believing him anyway. That's the part nobody warns you about. When a person you respect says you failed, in a room full of people you respect, your first instinct isn't to argue. It's to search yourself for the mistake, to assume they must know something you don't. So I went looking for my failure. I opened old emails, old files, old meeting notes, expecting to find the moment I dropped the ball. I found the opposite. I found an email I'd sent weeks earlier, warning about the exact risk that supposedly blindsided everyone. I found a reply telling me it was handled. And I found a timestamp on a document that didn't match the story I'd just been told in that room. I wasn't the one who lost the client, but it took me a long time to understand what actually happened and who had quietly decided it would be me. Let me go back to before that meeting, because you need to understand who I was in that company to understand why the blame landed the way it did. I've been a senior account manager there for 19 years. I wasn't flashy. I was the person they handed the difficult accounts to, the ones that needed steadiness more than charm. For the last 4 years, the biggest of those accounts was mine. It was the kind of client whose name went in the annual report, whose renewal paid for a whole floor of salaries. I knew that account better than I knew some members of my own family. I knew when they were happy, and I knew months in advance when they were starting to drift. My director was named Greg. He'd been promoted into the role about 2 years earlier. After the account he'd personally hit a rough patch. He was good in a room, quick with executives, the kind of manager who always seemed to be 3 steps ahead in a conversation. I liked him. That matters to what comes next, so I want to be honest about it. I liked him and I trusted him. So when the renewal started going sideways and the client eventually walked, and when Greg called that all-hands meeting, I went in expecting a hard conversation about what we could all learn. I did not expect to be the lesson. He didn't scream. That's not how these things happen in real offices. He was calm, almost regretful, which made it land harder. He said the account was lost because a critical deadline had been missed, because warning signs had been ignored, because the person closest to the client hadn't raised the alarm in time. He never said my name. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew who was closest to the client. I sat there and felt my face go hot. And here's the thing I'm not proud of. I didn't defend myself, because in that moment, surrounded by people watching me, I started to wonder if he was right. That's how it works. The doubt comes first. The blame is loudest when it's spoken by someone you've trusted, in front of people whose opinion you care about. You don't think that's a lie. You think, what did I miss? Greg ended with a line I still remember word for word. We can't afford mistakes like that again. And I nodded. I actually nodded. For the next several days, I lived inside that nod. I replayed every interaction with the client over the final months, looking for my failure. I lost sleep. I went quiet in meetings. I started to carry myself like a man who'd done something wrong, because everyone was treating me like one, and after a while you start to agree just to make the discomfort stop. But one detail wouldn't fit. It kept surfacing at odd hours, the way a splinter does. I remembered warning about this. Not vaguely, specifically. Months before the client walked, I had flagged the exact risk that supposedly blindsided everyone. I remembered writing it down. I remembered the slightly nervous feeling of putting a warning in writing, because part of me had wondered even then whether it would matter. Memory is unreliable, though, especially under that much pressure. So I decided to check the one place that doesn't bend to embarrassment or doubt. My sent folder. I want to be honest about how that felt, because it wasn't triumphant. Opening those emails felt like searching for proof of my own guilt. Some quiet, beaten-down part of me expected to find nothing, or worse, to find that I'd been careless after all. When you've been told often enough that you failed, you start hunting for the evidence to confirm it. Instead, the second email I opened stopped me cold. There it was, sent by me, weeks before anyone claimed the problem appeared. A clear, plainly worded message laying out the exact risk to the account, the early signs the client was unhappy, and a recommendation for how to get ahead of it. Not buried in jargon, not hedged, a warning in writing with a date on it. And it was addressed to Greg. I sat back in my chair and read it 3 times. Then I scrolled down, and the floor shifted under me again because there was a reply. Greg had answered, for words essentially, noted, "We'll handle it from here." I read that line and felt 2 things at once. The first was relief, sharp and physical. I hadn't imagined it. I had done my job. The second feeling was colder and took longer to name. If I had warned him, and he had told me he'd handle it, then why was I the one standing in front of that room, being told I'd ignore the warning signs? That question is where the story really starts. Everything before was just a man absorbing a blow. Everything after it was a man trying to understand where the blow actually came from. So I did what I should have done before I ever let myself feel guilty. I built a timeline. I lined up the dates. My warning email. Greg's reply. The internal decision, weeks later, to stay the course with the client, which Greg had described in the meeting as a call made carefully, with no red flags raised by anyone. No red flags. My email sat in my timeline like a flare, sent and acknowledged weeks before that decision. The story Greg told the room required a version of events in which no one saw the danger coming. But the timestamps said someone had. Me. And they said he'd known. There was a meeting note, too, from a status review 3 weeks after my email. I'd taken it myself, in my own shorthand, the way I always did. 2 lines down, almost in passing, I'd written that the account risk was flagged, owner Greg status monitoring. At the time, it had meant nothing, just a housekeeping line in a busy week. Now it sat in the timeline like a second flare beside the first. Not only had I warned him in writing, I'd recorded, weeks later in my own hand, that he had taken ownership of watching the thing he later swore no one had seen. I'm a careful person by nature, so even then, I didn't let myself jump. 1 email and 1 reply could be a misunderstanding. Maybe Greg had genuinely forgotten. Maybe in the chaos of a big account collapsing, an honest mistake had calcified into an unfair story without anyone meaning harm. I wanted that to be true. I want you to understand that. I was not looking for a villain. I was looking for a way to keep believing in the people I worked with. But a careful person also keeps pulling the thread, even when he's afraid of what's at the end of it. And the next thread I pulled wasn't about me at all. It started with a quiet comment from a colleague named Claire. She worked 2 desks down, steady and observant, the kind of person who notices the temperature of a room. When she caught me staring at my screen one evening, she didn't ask what was wrong. She just said, carefully, "You know, Tom said almost exactly what you're not saying right now." Before he left. Tom. I hadn't thought about Tom in a year. Tom had run a different project under Greg, one that had failed publicly the year before. He'd been blamed for it in much the same way, quietly, regretfully, in front of the right people. And I remembered, now that Claire had pointed at it, that Tom had spent his last weeks trying to tell anyone who'd listen that the story being told about him wasn't the true one. We'd all nodded politely and assumed he was a man making excuses. He was gone within 2 months. I didn't trust the memory alone, so later, when I was tracing the records, I went looking for Tom's case on purpose. The project he'd been blamed for had its own paper trail, and buried in it was an email from Tom raising a concern about resourcing, weeks before the failure, sent, like mine, to Greg. The reply was almost identical in spirit. Reassurance, ownership, a promise it was handled. Tom hadn't been making excuses at all. He'd been describing, accurately, a thing that had happened to him, and we'd all been too comfortable to hear it. I'd watched it happen. I'd even, God help me, half believe the official version, because believing was easier than asking what it might mean. That was the moment my own grievance stopped feeling personal and started feeling like a pattern. 2 of us now. Same shape. A failure under Greg's oversight, pinned cleanly on the person directly beneath him, told softly enough that no one questioned it. Two could still be coincidence. So I went looking for a third and a fourth. I had legitimate reasons to look at old project records. I'd managed enough of them. So over a couple of long evenings, I traced the failures of the last few years back to their official explanations. I wasn't looking for proof yet. I was looking for shape. The shape was there. The excuses were all different. A missed deadline here. A misjudged client there. A communication breakdown. Each one specific. Each one plausible. Each one wearing a different face. That's exactly why no one had ever connected them. But underneath the different excuses, the structure was identical. A project under Greg's direction had gone wrong. And in every case, the failure had come to rest on the shoulders of whoever reported directly to him, while Greg reported it upward as their mistake. He was never in the story as the man who decided. He was always in the story as the man who'd been let down. One of them I remembered firsthand. A logistics contract 2 years back, lost when a supplier missed a delivery window. The official note called it a vendor management failure by the coordinator who'd handled the account, a quiet woman who transferred to another department soon after. But the supplier's delay had followed a cut to the expedited shipping budget, and that cut had been signed off a level above her. The coordinator's name was on the failure. The signature on the decision that caused it was not. Once I'd seen the shape, I couldn't stop seeing it. I made myself test it the other way, too, because a pattern you want to see is the easiest kind to invent. I looked for the projects under Greg that had gone well. There were several, and in every one of those, his name was right there at the center of the success, front and forward, the architect of the win. Failure made him invisible and the people below him visible. Success did the exact reverse. A man can be unlucky with outcomes. No one is that consistent about which direction the credit and the blame happen to fall. I sat with that for a long night, because seeing the pattern wasn't the same as proving it, and I knew the difference mattered more than my anger did. A pattern of outcomes can still be bad luck. I needed to understand the mechanism. I needed to know how the blame actually got moved from one person to another in a way that left a record I could trust. The answer was in a place I almost didn't think to look. The client proposal itself. The document that had gone up the chain to justify staying the course with the account. The one Greg had presented as careful and well-reasoned. Most people never look at a document's version history. It's buried in a menu, the kind of thing you forget exists. But every edit leaves a trace with a name and a time attached. I opened the history, and I read it from the bottom up like an archaeologist. And there it was. An earlier version of that proposal had contained a risk note, a short paragraph flagging the very danger to the account that I'd warned about in my email. It had been written into the document, and then, in a later revision, it had been removed, cut out before the proposal went up to leadership, so that the people making the final call never saw the warning at all. I checked who made that edit and when. It was made from Greg's account, the night before the deadline. I remember the exact quality of the silence in my apartment when I read that. It wasn't rage. Rage would have been simpler. It was a kind of cold clarity, the feeling of a blurry picture suddenly resolving into something you can't unsee. He hadn't just let an unfair story stand. He had reached into the record and removed the evidence that would have contradicted it before anyone above him could read it. And here is where I have to be careful, because this is where it would be easy to make him a monster. He wasn't. That's the harder, truer thing. I knew Greg's history. I knew he'd been moved into his role after a failure of his own, and that he'd staked his standing on this exact account recovering. To admit there'd been a clear, early warning about the risk would have meant admitting he'd received that warning and decided to do nothing with it. It would have undone the careful image of a man 3 steps ahead. So when the account finally collapsed, he had a choice between absorbing the fall himself or letting it roll downhill onto the person closest to the client. He chose downhill, not because he was evil, because it cost him almost nothing as long as someone below him was standing there to catch it. That's the part that should frighten anyone who works for a living. The machinery that ended Tom's career and nearly ended mine wasn't malice. It was an ordinary man protecting himself in a system that let blame flow in only one direction. Understanding that didn't make me angrier. Strangely, it steadied me, because a frightened man defending himself behaves predictably, and predictable is something you can plan around. Still, I refused to act on a story I'd assembled in the heat of feeling wronged. I'd watched that meeting convict me on a story too, and I didn't want to become the thing I was accusing him of. So I did the slowest, least dramatic thing I could. I laid every piece side by side and asked whether it held together without my anger holding it up. My warning email with its date. Greg's reply telling me it was handled. The decision he described as raising no red flags. The version history showing the risk note written, then deleted from his account the night before the deadline. The meeting where I'd been named without being named. Tom, a year earlier, the same shape. The other failures, all running downhill to the same kind of person. It didn't just correlate. It interlocked. Every piece predicted the next. And when I finally stopped looking for the innocent explanation, it was because there wasn't one left that survived the dates. I exported everything. Quietly, carefully, the emails and the edit log and the timeline into a place that couldn't be revised or deleted out from under me. And then I did something that probably surprised Greg more than any accusation would have. I asked him for a meeting. I didn't go in to win. I'd learned, watching Tom, that you can't win an argument with the person who controls the story by shouting a better story at him. I went in to watch which words he reached for, because the words people choose when they're cornered tell you everything about what they know. I kept it simple. I told him I'd gone back through the record, and that I'd found my warning email and his reply, and that I was confused about how the account could have been described as a surprise. I watched his face. He didn't deny the email. That was the tell. A person who's innocent says, "What email? Show me." Greg didn't. He pivoted. He talked about the bigger picture, about how leadership needed a clear narrative, about how at our level we have to be willing to own outcomes, even when they're complicated. He told me I was misremembering the context, that I needed to own the result, rather than litigate the details. Not once did he say it didn't happen. He justified. He deflected. He reframed. And every sentence he spoke that wasn't a denial was, to me, a confirmation. By the time I left his office, I was calmer than when I'd walked in, because the meeting had told me what I needed. Not an apology. Apologies were never going to be where the truth landed. Where it landed was a review. I want to be clear that this part wasn't satisfying in the way people imagine. Taking documented evidence over your director's head is not a triumphant march. It's a quiet, sick-stomach decision made at a kitchen table at midnight, weighing 19 years of a career against the risk of being seen as the difficult one. Tom hadn't had the documents. I did. That was the only real difference between us, and I knew it. So I brought it forward, not as a grievance about a single meeting, but as a documented pattern. I handed over the timeline, the emails, the edit history. I didn't editorialize. I'd learned that the evidence was stronger when I let it speak and stayed quiet beside it. For a while, nothing visible happened. That's the part designed to make you lose your nerve, the silence. I assumed it had disappeared into some drawer. Then the silence ended. An internal review opened, quietly the way these things do. People I'd never spoken with began pulling the same records I had. And because the pattern was real, it held up under eyes far more official than mine. The review confirmed what the timeline had told me in my own desk weeks earlier. A recurring pattern of blame attached to the people directly beneath a manager, in cases where the documented decisions had been his. What made it hold wasn't my version of events. It was that the records were independently retrievable. The reviewers didn't have to take my word for the deleted risk note. The version history sat in the system with its timestamps and account names intact, exactly where I'd found it. They pulled the original proposal, the revision, and the edit log themselves, and the dates lined up the same way for them as they had for me at my kitchen table. The evidence I'd been afraid no one would believe turned out to need no belief at all. It only needed to be looked at. Leadership widened the look. They started re-examining how failures over the past few years had been attributed, and to whom. Tom's name came up. I made sure of it. I won't pretend it ended like a courtroom. There was no dramatic moment of Greg being marched out. Accountability in real companies is quieter and slower than that, and it's almost never as complete as you want. But it was real. Greg's role changed. The version of events that had nearly defined the rest of my career was corrected in the only record that mattered, the official one. And the company did the thing that mattered more than any single punishment. It changed how the machine worked. The policies changed. Risk sign-offs now had to be documented and attributable, so a warning couldn't simply be deleted from a file the night before a deadline without a trace. Decisions had to carry the name of the person who made them. Blame could no longer travel quietly downhill in the dark, because the lights had been turned on in the one hallway where it used to move. None of it gave me back the 3 weeks I'd spent believing I was the man who'd failed. Nothing gives you that back. But it gave me something I hadn't expected to care about as much as I did. The record was true now. When someone looked up that account in 10 years, they'd find what actually happened, not the story told in that room. I stayed, for a while, on different terms, with my eyes open in a way they hadn't been before. Then I moved on when I chose to, on my own schedule, which mattered to me more than I'd have guessed. The strangest part of the aftermath was how I came to feel about Greg. I expected to hate him. I didn't in the end. I understood him, which is a different and more uncomfortable thing. I'd watched a frightened man choose the easiest exit from his own mistake, and I'd seen how a system made that exit run straight through the people who trusted him. Understanding it isn't forgiving it. It's just refusing to pretend it took a monster, when all it really took was an ordinary man and a machine that led him. The lesson I carry isn't about Greg, though. It's about that nod. The moment in the meeting when I was told I'd failed, and I bowed my head and started searching myself for the proof. Because the most dangerous part of being blamed isn't the blame. It's how quickly you'll do the accuser's work for him. How readily you'll dismantle your own certainty just because someone you respected sounded so sure. I almost convicted myself on his word, in an empty room, weeks after the meeting was over. What saved me wasn't courage. It was a record, a dated email I'd half forgotten, a timestamp on a document, the boring, unglamorous habit of writing things down. Evidence doesn't care how sure your director sounded. It just sits there, patient, telling the truth long after everyone has agreed to a lie. So now I write things down. Not out of suspicion exactly, out of respect for the version of me who might one day be sitting in a hot room, being told he failed, and needs something steadier than memory to hold on to. The hardest part was never the blame. It was how easily I almost believed it myself.